In the 41st millennium, there is only war. The Imperium of man spans 1,000,000 worlds, each one a testament to humanity's desperate struggle against annihilation. Gods whisper from the warp. Xenos empires press from every border. And the galaxy itself seems bent on humanity's extinction. Into this nightmare of endless conflict, something arrived that should not exist. Something that turned the fundamental laws of reality into mere suggestions. If you crave more tales from the dark millennium, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who support the channel. The first sign was the silence. Every astropath within 3 sectors simultaneously fell into catatonic states, their minds overwhelmed by something their psychic senses couldn't categorize. It wasn't the familiar corruption of chaos, nor the alien wrongness of Xeno's presence. It was absence, a void in the shape of consciousness. A thing that existed in defiance of the warp's influence, yet blazed like a star to those who could perceive beyond the material. The second sign was visual. High above the hive world of Tartarus Secundus, reality simply parted, not torn as when demons claw their way into real space, not bent as when ships translate from the Imperium. The universe acknowledged that something was about to be present, and matter rearranged itself accordingly to make room. A human figure materialized in the void, naked, impossibly blue, glowing with an internal radiance that had nothing to do with reflected light. He was 30 feet tall in that moment, though the concept of height seemed negotiable for this being. His body was perfectly proportioned, mathematically precise, as though someone had calculated the ideal human form and rendered it in sapphire energy. Dr. Jonathan Ostman, Dr. Manhattan, hung in the vacuum of space and observed. His perception split across infinite timelines simultaneously. He saw Tartarus Secundus as it was now, a polluted hive world of 18 billion souls, its surface covered in kilometer-deep layers of industrial architecture, its atmosphere thick with chemical runoff. Its people living short, brutal lives in service to an imperium that cared nothing for their individual suffering. He saw the world's past, its colonization during the Great Crusade, its compliance under threat of orbital bombardment, 10,000 years of grinding expansion and decay. He saw its future, 100 different potential outcomes spreading like branches, most ending in destruction, viral bombardment, demonic incursion, Xenos invasion, simple industrial collapse. He saw the Imperium itself across all its temporal permutations. 1,000,000 worlds, each one a variation on the same theme of authoritarian brutality and desperate survival. He observed the Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars. Their fusion of flesh and machine, their worship of technology as divine mystery. He watched the Space Marines prosecute campaigns across 1,000 war zones, superhuman warriors who lived only for battle. He perceived the Inquisition's endless paranoia, the Ecclesiarchy's fanatical faith, the Imperial Guard's pointless sacrifices measured in billions, and he saw the throne room on Terra through walls, through defensive fields, through the psychic wards that should have prevented any observation. He saw the Emperor, a corpse sustained by machinery, and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. His consciousness stretched thin across the galaxy, simultaneously present in the warp as a nascent god and dying slowly in real space. A being who had sacrificed everything for humanity and received only eternal agonizing stasis in return. Manhattan found it interesting. He reduced his size to 7 feet, easier for humans to process, and teleported to the surface of Tartarus Secundus. He materialized in Hive Primus sublevel 847 in a factorium district where servitors mindlessly assembled lasgun power packs under the supervision of bored overseers. The moment he appeared, every machine within 50 meters sparked and died, their circuits unable to process the quantum interference field his body generated. The workers stared. They had spent their entire lives in these dark corridors, breathing recycled air thick with promethium fumes, their skin gray from malnutrition, and their bodies bent from decades of repetitive labor. Many had never seen daylight. None had ever seen anything like the glowing blue man who now stood among the silent assembly lines. Manhattan looked at them. He perceived their genetic code, their cellular structure, their memories encoded in neural pathways. Modified humans, baseline stock altered for increased endurance and decreased ambition, generational mutations from environmental toxins, crude augmetics replacing failed organs. Each one a small tragedy of wasted potential born into a system that would extract their labor and discard their corpses. "What are you?" one of them finally whispered. The question barely audible over the industrial ambient noise that never ceased even when the machine stopped. Manhattan considered the question. What was he? A being of pure quantum energy wearing a human shape from habit. A consciousness that had transcended physical limitation but retained the ghost of Jonathan Ostman's identity. A god who remembered mortality. "I am observing," he said finally, his voice carrying perfect clarity despite making no effort to project it. The workers fell to their knees. Some wept, others pressed their foreheads to the oil-stained flow. Muttering prayers they had learned by rote, prayers to the Emperor, to the Omnissiah, to any divine force that might acknowledge their existence. Manhattan tilted his head, studying their behavior. Religious reverence in response to the unknown. A predictable reaction, but the intensity was notable. These people lived in such complete deprivation that even a glowing stranger inspired immediate worship. Then the alarms began. Cogitator banks in the Factorium's control center had registered the power fluctuation. Surveillance feeds showed an unidentified entity in a restricted work zone. Automated protocols activated, lockdown procedures engaged, and somewhere in the hive's upper levels, men with guns received orders to investigate. Manhattan knew they were coming. He could see them across multiple timelines. Adeptus Arbit's enforcers in carapace armor, armed with shock mauls and suppression shields. In most futures, they arrived in minutes. In some, they opened fire immediately. In others, they attempted to apprehend him. The outcomes varied, but the fundamental pattern remained. Force met with escalating force. He could leave. Teleportation was effortless. He could observe this universe from anywhere, from the galactic core to the void between galaxies. But the workers still knelt before him, and he found himself curious about what they expected from this moment. "Why do you worship what you don't understand?" he asked. An elderly woman, her face a map of scars and her hands twisted from industrial accidents, looked up at him with cataract-clouded eyes. "Because we must worship something, my lord. The Emperor is far away. You are here." Manhattan processed this faith as transaction, devotion offered in hope of reciprocation. They knelt not from genuine reverence, but from desperate pragmatism. Perhaps this glowing stranger could improve their circumstances, so they offered him the same prayers they offered to a distant corpse god who had never answered. "I cannot save you," he said, not unkindly. "Then kill us quickly," another worker responded, his voice flat with exhaustion. "It would be mercy." The enforcers arrived. The blast doors exploded inward with pneumatic force and Adeptus Arbit's enforcers stormed through the breach with military precision. Their carapace armor was painted matte black, marked with the scales of justice in faded white, symbols of imperial law that carried absolute authority in the hive. Suppression shields locked together in a wall of reinforced plastisteel and shock mauls crackled with electrical charge behind them. "Citizen, identify yourself and submit to arrest." The lead enforcer's voice came through his helmet's Vox grill, distorted and amplified to inspire compliance through intimidation. "You are in violation of imperial law, unauthorized presence in a restricted work zone, disruption of production quotas, and suspected heretical manifestation." Manhattan looked at them. He saw their biological systems, elevated heart rates, adrenaline flooding their bloodstreams, neural patterns indicating trained aggression held barely in check. He saw their equipment, the shield's molecular structure, the shock maul's capacitor arrays, the lasguns holstered at their sides. He saw their futures. Most would die in service to the Imperium within years, their deaths recorded only as numerical adjustments to personnel rosters. "I'm not a citizen," Manhattan said simply. "Then you are a criminal." The enforcer raised his shock maul and the squad tightened their formation. Final warning, submit or be subdued. Manhattan did not move. He existed in the same space, but movement implied transition between states, and he could simply be in different configurations without the intermediate steps. To the enforcers, it appeared as though the blue figure had done nothing. Yet, their targeting reticles suddenly couldn't lock onto him. Auspex scanners returned contradictory data. The target was 7 feet tall and 300 feet tall simultaneously, present and absent, matter and energy without distinction. The lead enforcer hesitated. His training covered rebellious workers, cultist uprisings, even minor demonic manifestations. This fell outside his operational parameters. The workers remained kneeling, their heads bowed, prayers continuing in desperate whispers. They knew what happened when the arbits arrived. Beatings for failure to meet quotas. Executions for suspected heresy. Entire production line purged if contamination was suspected. The Blue Stranger had brought punishment down upon them simply by existing. "Please," the elderly woman said, her voice cracking. "We did nothing wrong. We only worked. We always work." One of the enforcers glanced at her, then away. Guilt? No. Manhattan perceived it more accurately. Discomfort. These men knew they were enforcing an unjust system, but justice and injustice were irrelevant concepts in the Imperium. There was only compliance and heresy, order and chaos. The enforcers were the machinery by which compliance was maintained. Their individual morality as irrelevant as the feelings of the servitors who had been human once. "Clear the workers from the area," the lead enforcer ordered. "This is an inquisitorial matter now." Manhattan's perception shifted. In timelines, inquisitorial agents arrived within the hour. In many of those, they declared exterminatus on Tartarus Secundus as a precautionary measure. Better to destroy one world than risk contamination spreading. 18 billion lives erased with orbital bomb. Ardment, their ashes scattered across a dead world, and the Imperium would simply adjust its production quotas accordingly. For the first time since arriving in this universe, Manhattan felt something approximating concern, not for himself. He existed beyond harm, but the casual willingness to extinguish billions of lives as administrative procedure was notable. He had seen authoritarian governments before, studied totalitarian systems, observed humanity's capacity for organized cruelty. But the Imperium operated on a scale that made Earth's worst regimes look like amateur exercises in oppression. "I will speak with your Inquisition," Manhattan said. The enforcers recoiled. Speaking the Inquisition's name was itself suspicious. Common citizens lived entire lives without acknowledging its existence aloud. Only heretics and fools drew inquisitorial attention deliberately. "You request interrogation?" The lead enforcer's voice carried genuine confusion. "I request conversation," Manhattan corrected. "I'm here to observe this civilization. Your authorities will have questions. It is efficient to address them directly." The enforcer stared at the glowing blue figure. His tactical doctrine completely inadequate for this situation. He activated his Vox bead, speaking into encrypted channels that connected him to higher command structures. Words were exchanged, orders relayed upward through bureaucratic chains that stretched from this factory floor to offices in the Hive's upper levels, where men who had never touched machinery made decisions about those who touched nothing else. While they communicated, Manhattan observed the workers. They remained kneeling, their prayers now silent, their eyes downcast. They expected death. Life in the Imperium had taught them that any deviation from routine ended in punishment, and the appearance of a glowing god figure in their workspace was certainly deviation. He could save them. Molecular manipulation would be trivial. Reconstruct their damaged tissues, optimize their genetic code, teleport them to a habitable world where the Imperium's grasp was lighter. He could do it in microseconds, effortlessly without diminishing his own power in any measurable way. But he had learned this lesson before on his own Earth and relearned it with each universe he visited. Saving individuals didn't address systemic problems if he rescued these workers. The Imperium would simply replace them with others. The machine would continue grinding regardless of which specific bodies fed. And yet, Manhattan looked at the elderly woman, saw her timeline collapse toward its inevitable conclusion. She would die within months, her body finally surrendering to accumulated industrial toxins. She would die on this factory FL. Or, her corpse rendered into protein paste to feed other workers. Her existence recorded only as a single data point in production efficiency metrics. She had never known comfort, never experienced beauty, never been valued as anything beyond her labor output. He moved his hand, not physically, but conceptually. Reality rearranged itself around his intention. The tumors growing in her lungs unmade themselves. Cellular structures reverting to healthy configurations. The cataracts in her eyes dissolved. Scarred tissue regenerated into healthy skin. Decades of malnutrition reversed as her body suddenly had access to perfect cellular fuel. She gasped, her vision clearing, her breathing suddenly effortless for the first time in years. What did you?" She stared at her hands, flexing fingers that had been bent in arthritic moments before. The other workers looked up, saw her transformation, and their prayers intensified. Several began weeping. Others prostrated themselves completely, pressing their faces into oil-slicked floor. Heresy, one of the enforcers whispered. Witchcraft. Mutation. The lead enforcer raised his lasgun. Nobody move. This entire sector is under quarantine. Manhattan saw the timelines shift. In the original paths, only the workers died during purging operations. Now, because he had healed one woman, the Inquisition would sterilize 3 entire sublevels. Thousands of additional deaths to ensure contamination didn't spread. His intervention had made things worse. He had seen this pattern before. In Vietnam, when his presence had escalated conflict rather than preventing it. In his own timeline, when saving Laurie's life had set in motion events that nearly ended humanity, the quantum foam of causality was sensitive to disruption. Change rippled outward in unpredictable ways, and good intentions frequently produced catastrophic outcomes. The Imperium was a machine optimized for survival through brutality. Any component that deviated from specifications was removed. He was a foreign element introduced into a closed system, and the system's immune response was genocidal efficiency. Interesting, Manhattan said quietly. Through the factory walls, through kilometers of industrial architecture, through the planet's crust itself, Manhattan perceived ships entering orbit. Inquisitorial vessels, their hulls marked with the Rosette sigil. Their holds containing men and women trained to root out corruption regardless of cost. They would burn this hive to bedrock if necessary, and they would consider it a success. The lead enforcer received new orders through his Vox bead. His posture shifted. No longer an arresting officer, now a guard maintaining containment until superiors arrived. Inquisitor Helisha Crack will arrive within the hour, he announced, his voice tight with barely contained fear. Until then, this sector is sealed. Anyone who attempts to flee will be shot. Manhattan remained perfectly still. An hour, minutes for the workers to contemplate their deaths. Minutes for fear to replace their brief moment of hope. Minutes to observe how the Imperium treated even the possibility of deviation. He would wait, not because the enforcers could stop him, they couldn't, but because he wanted to see what came next. The Inquisition represented the Imperium's ideological enforcement arm, the philosophical immune system that purged dangerous thoughts as ruthlessly as it purged Xeno's taint. They would try to understand him. They would categorize, analyze, interrogate. And when their understanding proved inadequate, they would try to kill him. He already knew they would fail, but their attempt would reveal much about this civilization's nature. So, Dr. Manhattan stood among terrified workers and nervous enforcers, glowing softly in the industrial darkness, and waited for the Inquisition to arrive. Inquisitor Helisha Crack arrived not with fanfare, but with calculated silence. Her stormtrooper escort, veterans in crimson carapace armor, their hell guns primed and their discipline absolute, secured the factorium perimeter with surgical efficiency. Worker hab blocks 3 levels above and below were evacuated under threat of summary execution. Atmospheric processes were rerouted to prevent contamination spread. Gun servitors took position at every access corridor. Their targeting arrays linked to a central cogitator that calculated firing solutions based on threat assessment algorithms older than most planetary governments. The Inquisitor herself entered through the main blast doors, her power armor humming with barely audible energy. She was tall, augmented with skeletal reinforcement that let her move with unnatural grace despite wearing ceramite plates. Half her face was original flesh, pale, scarred, middle-aged. The other half was a chrome augment that housed a bionic eye capable of spectrum analysis from infrared to ultraviolet. Her right hand was human. Her left was a power fist, its energy field currently dormant. She saw Manhattan immediately. Her biological eye widened fractionally, the only outward sign of surprise she permitted herself. Her augment eye cycled through scanning modes, feeding data directly into her cognitive implants. Temperature ambient. The subject generated no heat signature. Mass inconsistent. Readings fluctuated between 70 kilograms and infinite. Composition unknown. Molecular structure refused to resolve into recognizable patterns. Psychic resonance. Null. Not absent like a pariah, but null as though the subject stead in a space where psychic phenomena simply didn't apply. Stand down, she ordered the Arbit's end forces. They retreated gratefully, forming a perimeter at the Factorum's entrance. The workers remained kneeling, many trembling, all silent. They knew that speaking without permission in an inquisitor's presence was grounds for execution. Helicia approached Manhattan with measured steps, each footfall deliberate. She stopped away, close enough to demonstrate courage, far enough to react if the entity proved hostile. Her stormtroopers maintained firing positions, their hellguns trained on the glowing figure, though she suspected conventional weapons would prove entirely useless. "I am Inquisitor Helicia Crack of the Ordo Hereticus," she announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. "By the decree of the God Emperor of mankind, I command you to identify yourself and state your purpose in Imperial space." Manhattan regarded her. He saw her cybernetic enhancements, the neural implants that accelerated her cognition, the toxin filters in her respiratory system, the cardiac augmentation that let her survive injuries that would kill baseline humans. He saw her past, battles against chaos cultists, purges of heretical movements, planets burned on her authority. He saw her future. Most timelines ended with her death and service. A few showed her ascending to the rank of Lord Inquisitor. None showed her ever questioning the system she served. "I am Dr. Jonathan Ostman," he said. "I'm observing your civilization." Observing. Helicia's augment eye pulsed as it recorded his words, ran them through linguistic analysis protocols, searched for hidden meanings in syntax and phrasing. "You claim to be a scholar, an explorer. I am what I am. The labels are yours, not mine. Where do you come from?" She gestured upward with her human hand. "What realm spawned you? The warp? Some Xenos dimension? A dark corner of the webway?" Manhattan processed her questions. She conceptualized reality in specific categories. Material realm, Immaterium, Xenos territories. Her universe had structure. Hostile forces arrayed against humanity. Theological explanations for the unexplainable. He existed outside those categories entirely, and she needed to force him into one to determine threat level. "I came from another reality," he said. "Your warp does not affect me. I am not Xenos. I am human in origin, though I have transcended that form." Transcended. Helicia's biological eye narrowed. Apotheosis through technology, demonic possession, Xenos augmentation, quantum accident. "I was disintegrated at the molecular level and subsequently reconstructed myself as living energy." Silence fell over the factory. The stormtroopers shifted nervously, their training inadequate for this situation. The workers dared not breathe. Helicia's mind raced through theological and philosophical frameworks, searching for precedent. "You claim to be a god," she said finally. "I make no such claim. I am what I am. You may categorize me however your theology requires. The Emperor is the only god of humanity." Helicia's voice hardened. "All others are false idols, masks worn by the ruinous powers to deceive the faithful. If you are what you claim, you are either demon or Xenos abomination. Either way, you are heresy incarnate." Manhattan tilted his head slightly. "Your Emperor is dying. He has been dying for thousands of years, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily. His consciousness is fragmented across the galaxy, fighting a war in a dimension where physical laws don't apply. He is not a god. He is a man who became trapped in godhood." The temperature in the factorium dropped. Not physically, Manhattan hadn't altered the atmospheric conditions, but psychologically the weight of his words pressed down on every Imperial servant present. Helicia's power fist activated, wreathing her mechanical hand in crackling energy fields. "You dare!" "I state observable fact," Manhattan interrupted calmly. "I perceive your Emperor directly through walls, through defensive wards, through the barriers. You believe inviolate. He sits on a throne of gold, his body a rotted husk. His mind screaming silently across the warp. He sacrificed himself for humanity. The Imperium has turned that sacrifice into theological justification for endless suffering. Heresy." Helicia raised her power fist. Stormtroopers, open fire. Hellguns discharged simultaneously. Lost bolts crossed the factorium in intersecting lines of superheated light. Each one capable of punching through plasteel, each aimed at critical mass points on Manhattan's body. The bolts passed through him, not deflected, not absorbed. They simply traveled through the space he occupied as though he wasn't there. Their energy dissipating harmlessly against the far wall. Manhattan hadn't moved, hadn't raised a defense, hadn't acknowledged the attack in any way. He simply existed in a configuration that didn't interact with directed energy weapons. "Ineffective," he observed. Your technology operates on principles I mastered decades ago. Energy weapons, projectile weapons, explosive devices, all require interaction with physical matter. I can choose not to interact. Helicia's augment eyes cycled through new scanning modes, desperately seeking vulnerability. What are you? I told you, Jonathan Ostman, Dr. Manhattan, a being of quantum energy wearing human shape from habit. He gestured toward the workers who remained frozen in terror. I healed one of them. She was dying. From industrial toxins accumulated over decades of forced labor. I reversed the cellular damage. Your response is to quarantine this sector and prepare for purging operations. Mutation is heresy, Helicia said reflexively. Unauthorized healing suggests warp corruption or Xeno's influence. Contamination must be contained. You will kill thousands of people because I demonstrated compassion. I will kill thousands of people to save billions. Helicia corrected. One infected sector spreads to a dozen spreads to the entire hive. The entire hive becomes a breeding ground for chaos. Better to burn thousands now than lose the whole world later. Her voice was steady, certain. The logic of imperial doctrine carried out without hesitation or remorse. Manhattan studied her. She genuinely believed this not through indoctrination alone, though that was present, but through experience. She had seen chaos, corruption spread like disease, watched entire populations turn to madness and mutation, prosecuted campaigns where mercy had allowed evil to metastasize into apocalypse. In the Imperium's context, her logic was sound. The universe they inhabited was hostile, predatory, genuinely dangerous. Chaos wasn't metaphor. It was real, tangible, capable of corrupting matter and thought through proximity alone. The Imperium's brutal methods weren't sadistic excess. They were survival mechanisms honed over millennia of existential warfare. And yet, the cost was staggering. I could stop you, Manhattan said quietly. Disassemble your weapons at the molecular level. Teleport you to a distant world. Reconstruct every person in this hive into perfect health. I could do this effortlessly without diminishing my own capabilities. Then why don't you? Helicia challenged, her power fist still raised, knowing it was useless but maintaining the gesture from principle. Because I have learned that interference creates consequences. I save thousands here and somewhere else systems collapse. I remove you and another Inquisitor arrives with more extreme measures. I heal everyone and the Imperium adapts, labels me a threat to their entire civilization. Change ripples outward in unpredictable patterns. So you do nothing, Helicia said. You have the power of gods and the passivity of a coward. Manhattan considered this. Was it cowardice or wisdom born from watching his interventions consistently make situations worse? He had tried to save his own Earth from nuclear war and nearly destroyed it. He had tried to create life on a distant world and abandoned it when his presence disrupted its development. He had learned across multiple realities that raw power without understanding created chaos. I am here to observe, he said again, to understand why your civilization exists in this configuration. Why you choose brutality over mercy, suffering over comfort, endless war over peace. We do not choose, Helicia said bitterly. Choice is a luxury afforded to those who live in peaceful universes. We live in hell, Dr. Ostman. And in hell, the only choice is between fighting and dying. She lowered her power fist, the energy field dissipating. She couldn't harm him, couldn't contain him, couldn't even properly categorize him, but she could fulfill her duty. I am declaring the sector under inquisitorial quarantine, she announced. All personnel will undergo mandatory screening for corruption. The workers will be interrogated. If contamination is confirmed, purging operations will commence. Manhattan saw the timelines branch. In most, the workers died. In some, entire levels burned. In a few, the Inquisition expanded operations until half the hive was sterilized. You are repeating a pattern, he said, escalating force to maintain control. It is unsustainable. It has sustained us for thousands of years, Helicia replied. Until you can offer an alternative that doesn't result in humanity's extinction, I suggest you observe silently. She turned to leave, then paused. One question, Doctor. If you can perceive all possibilities, all futures, why come here at all? What could you possibly hope to learn from observing our nightmare? Manhattan was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, perceiving across temporal dimensions simultaneously. Because, he said finally, in every timeline, across every possible configuration of events, your species survives. You shouldn't. The mathematics of your situation suggest inevitable extinction. And yet, you persist. I want to understand why. Helicia stared at him, her augmetic eye recording his words, her biological eye showing something that might have been hope or might have been horror. Perhaps, she said quietly, some questions shouldn't be answered. She left the factorum, her stormtroopers following in disciplined formation. The workers remained kneeling, waiting for judgment. And Manhattan stood among them, glowing softly in the darkness, watching a civilization tear itself apart in the name of survival. The interrogations began within hours. Manhattan observed from positions scattered across the hive simultaneously. He stood in the factorum where workers were separated into individual holding cells, their wrists bound with plastic restraints, their faces blank with resigned terror. He existed in the inquisitorial command center levels above where Helicia Crack coordinated purge operations with the cold efficiency of a surgeon excising tumors. He watched from the holding pens where thousands of residents of adjacent sectors waited to be processed. There C. Rhymes simply living too close to where he had manifested. The elderly woman he had healed, her name was Mara Kellis, he learned from the interrogation records, sat in a plastisteel chair bolted to the floor. Across from her, an inquisitorial acolyte operated a modified medic scanner, its sensors probing her biology for evidence of mutation, warp corruption, or Xenos taint. Cellular regeneration is perfect, the acolyte reported, his voice clinically detached. Too perfect. Natural healing leaves scar tissue, imperfect reconstruction. This is pristine, as though her body was reconstructed from an ideal template. Helicia stood in the corner of the interrogation chamber, her arms crossed, her augment eye recording every detail. Mutation. No genetic markers for chaotic influence, no warp signature residue, no evidence of biological manipulation through conventional means. The acolyte looked up from his scanner, confusion evident despite his training. It's as though she was simply made healthy, spontaneously. Impossibly. Nothing is impossible, Helicia said, only unexplained. Continue analysis. Mara said nothing. She had lived years in the Imperium, long enough to know that speaking without permission during interrogation meant torture. So she sat in silence, her newly cleared eyes taking in details she hadn't been able to see in decades. The rust patterns on the interrogation chamber's walls. The slight tremor in the acolyte hands. The way Inquisitor Crack's jaw tightened when she received Vox reports through her cranial implant. Manhattan watched and learned. The Imperium's investigation protocols were thorough, paranoid, and fundamentally theological. They didn't simply search for evidence of corruption. They assumed corruption and sought to quantify its extent. Every citizen was potentially compromised. Every unexplained phenomenon was potentially heretical. Trust was a tactical error. Suspicion was survival instinct refined into doctrine. In another chamber, workers who had witnessed his arrival were subjected to psychic interrogation. An inquisitorial psyker, a sanctioned soul bound to the Imperium service, pressed his withered hands against their foreheads and rifled through their memories like sorting through files. The process was invasive, painful, occasionally fatal when minds proved too fragile to withstand psychic contact. They saw a blue giant, the psyker reported, his voice hollow and distant. Naked, glowing, speaking with perfect clarity. He claimed to be human. He claimed to be observing. No evidence of demonic whispers in their thoughts. No chaotic taint in their memory patterns. Just fear and hope. The last word emerged with something approaching disgust. They hoped he would save them. Hope is the first symptom of corruption. Helicia said, those who hope for salvation outside the Emperor's grace have already begun the descent into heresy. Manhattan found this fascinating. Hope itself was pathologized. The Imperium had become so committed to its doctrine of suffering that even the desire for relief was suspicious. Citizens were expected to endure without complaint, to accept their misery as necessary sacrifice, to find meaning only in service to a system that treated them as disposable components. It was efficient in a horrifying way. A population that didn't hope for better couldn't be disappointed, couldn't rebel, couldn't question whether their suffering was truly necessary or merely convenient for those in power. He manifested in the interrogation chamber, appearing between Helicia and the psyker without transition. Both recoiled. The psyker gasped, his connection to the warp suddenly disrupted by Manhattan's presence, not suppressed like a pariah's null field, but confused, as though the Imperium couldn't determine whether Manhattan was matter or energy, present or absent, real or theoretical. You violate quarantine protocols, Helicia said, her hand moving to her bolt pistol even though she knew it was futile. I observe, Manhattan replied. You interrogate innocent people for the crime of witnessing my presence. This is unjust. Justice is a luxury we cannot afford. Helicia's augment eye focused on him, recording, analyzing, searching for any exploitable weakness. These people have been exposed to unknown phenomena. Their memories are evidence. Their compliance ensures the corruption doesn't spread. They have committed no crime. Their existence near you is the crime. Helicia gestured toward the psyker who had recovered enough to stand, though he kept his distance from Manhattan. Chaos corrupts through proximity. A single exposed citizen becomes a vector. They return to their hab blocks. Their corruption spreads to families, to work crews, to entire population centers. Within months, the hive becomes a breeding ground for demons. I am not chaos, Manhattan said. You claim to be a god. That alone is heresy. I claim to be what I am. You impose theological categories because your worldview demands them. Helicia stepped closer, her bolt pistol now drawn, but pointed at the floor. Then explain yourself in terms I can categorize. Are you machine? No. Xenos? No. I am human in origin. The Emperor is the pinnacle of human evolution. There is no transcendence beyond his example. Therefore, you are either lying about your humanity or you have achieved false apotheosis through forbidden means. Her logic was circular, self-reinforcing, impervious to evidence that contradicted its premises. Either way, you represent a threat to imperial doctrine. Manhattan saw the pattern clearly now. The Imperium didn't just fight external threats. It fought ideas, alternative philosophies, different ways of organizing civilization. The mere existence of something that contradicted imperial theology was dangerous, regardless of whether that thing posed actual harm. He was dangerous, not because of what he might do, but because of what he represented. Proof that humanity could evolve beyond the Emperor's vision. That transcendence was possible outside imperial doctrine. That the suffering they endured might not be the only path forward. You fear me, he observed. I fear what you could become, Helicia corrected. I have seen miracles turned to nightmares. Angels revealed as demons. Saviors who delivered only damnation. Every Xenos empire that promised peace delivered slavery. Every chaotic prophet who offered power demanded souls. The universe has taught humanity a single lesson over thousands of years. Trust nothing, suspect everything, and purge what you cannot control. And if I cannot be purged, Helicia's jaw tightened, then I escalate. Call for Space Marine intervention. Request exterminatus authorization. Sacrifice this world to save 100 others. She holstered her bolt pistol. The gesture one of pragmatic acceptance rather than surrender. You say you can see all futures. Doctor, tell me, in how many of them does letting you exist freely result in humanity's benefit? Manhattan perceived across timelines. In some his presence inspired philosophical movements that destabilized imperial authority, leading to civil wars that weakened humanity against external threats. In others, his intervention prevented catastrophes but created dependency. Civilizations that waited for his salvation rather than fighting for survival. In a few he became a weapon used by one faction against another. His power distorted into just another tool of war. In none of them did his presence produce unambiguous benefit. Your point is made, he said quietly. Then you understand. Helicia's voice softened fractionally. The first hint of something approaching respect. This is not a universe where gods can be benevolent. Power attracts corruption. Miracles demand prices. The only safety lies in vigilance, suspicion, and the willingness to destroy what we cannot understand. Manhattan looked at Mara Kellis, still sitting silent in her interrogation chair, her healed body a testament to his capability and his curse. He had wanted to help. He had made her life objectively better. And in doing so, he had marked her for death. What will happen to her? He asked. Depends on the investigation's conclusions, Helicia said. If she shows no signs of corruption, she'll be returned to the work Cree. WS under observation. If there's any doubt, she left the sentence unfinished. But the implication was clear. And if I remove all doubt, if I provide you with complete information about what I did, how it functions, why it poses no corruption risk, then you provide evidence that you can reshape human biology at will, which makes you more dangerous, not less. Helicia shook her head. There is no scenario where proving your capabilities makes the Imperium trust you, Doctor. Only scenarios where we escalate our response. A paradox, Manhattan observed. The more I demonstrate my benevolence, the more threatening I become. Welcome to the 41st millennium, Helicia said with bitter humor. Where good intentions pave roads to damnation, and the only trustworthy beings are those who openly declare their hostility. Manhattan processed this. The Imperium had created a system where kindness was suspect, compassion was weakness, and the only reliable currency was violence. It was insane. It was also, given the threats they faced, possibly the only configuration that allowed survival. He had encountered dystopias before, authoritarian governments, totalitarian regimes, societies built on oppression, but they had always contained seeds of their own destruction, internal contradictions that would eventually cause collapse. The Imperium's dystopia was self-sustaining, its brutality justified by genuine existential threats, its cruelty defended as necessary evil. And the horrifying truth was that they might be right. I will leave this world, Manhattan said finally. But not this civilization. I will continue observing. I cannot stop you, Helicia acknowledged. But I can warn you, the deeper you look into the Imperium, the more horrors you'll find. We are not a civilization worth saving, Doctor. We are a species that has sacrificed everything beautiful and human to survive. What remains isn't worth preserving. It's only worth perpetuating because extinction is worse. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. One last question. You healed that woman because you felt compassion. But now you see the consequences. Investigation, suffering, potential execution. Does that change how you feel about your intervention? Manhattan looked at Mara, saw her timelines branching. In most, she survived the investigation and returned to work. Her healed body allowing her to labor more efficiently, extending her usefulness to the Imperium by years before inevitable industrial accidents or age-related failure. In sum, she became a subject of ongoing study. Her biology catalogued as a curiosity, her life more comfortable, but less free. In a few, she was executed as a precaution. Her molecules recycled into corpse starch to feed other workers. I do not regret helping her, he said. But I understand now that help in this context is indistinguishable from harm. Helicia nodded slowly. Then you're beginning to understand the Imperium. Every choice is wrong. We simply choose the least terrible option and pray the Emperor forgives us for the necessary evils we commit in his name. She left the chamber, her stormtroopers falling into formation behind her. The Psyker remained, keeping his distance from Manhattan. His presence a reminder that even the Imperium's sanctioned wielders of psychic power feared what they didn't understand. Manhattan stood in the interrogation chamber surrounded by the architecture of a civilization that had turned survival into theology and suffering into sacrament. And for the first time since achieving quantum consciousness, Dr. Manhattan felt something approaching doubt. Manhattan left Tartarus Secundus without ceremony. One moment he existed in the interrogation chamber. The next he was light years away standing on the hull of an Imperial Navy cruiser as it translated from the warp into real space. The ship was the Undaunted Resolve, a lunar-class cruiser kilometers long, its hull scarred by centuries of combat, its Gothic architecture a monument to the Imperium's aesthetic philosophy, function wrapped in religious iconography, every surface adorned with eagles, skulls, and prayers inscribed in High Gothic. Gun decks bristled with weapons batteries. Lance arrays protruded like accusing fingers. Shield generators hummed with barely contained energy. Manhattan stood on its dorsal surface, surrounded by void, and watched the crew's panicked response to his presence. Alarms shrieked through the ship's corridors. Auspex arrays detected an unidentified object, humanoid, glowing, generating impossible energy signatures, standing in hard vacuum where nothing should survive. Weapons officers shouted targeting coordinates. The ship's captain, a stern woman named Valerica Thorne, received reports through Vox systems with increasing alarm. Target is biological, an officer reported from the Auspex station. No void suit detected, no life support equipment. It's just standing there. Life signs. Captain Thorne demanded inconsistent readings. Sometimes registers as human, sometimes as pure energy, sometimes doesn't register at all. Tactical assessment? Unknown, Captain. It could be a warp manifestation. Could be Xeno's stealth technology. Could be. The officer paused, his voice dropping. Could be demonic. Captain Thorne stood from her command throne, her augmetic leg whirring as she moved toward the main viewport. Through reinforced armaglass, she could see the glowing blue figure standing impossibly on her ship's hull, arms at his sides, gazing toward the star system they just entered. Shields to maximum, she ordered. Prepare to fire point defense turrets and someone get me an astropath. I want confirmation this isn't warp corruption. Manhattan heard all of this through the ship's walls, his perception extending through bulkheads and into the minds of crew members kilometers away. Fear dominated their thoughts, not personal fear for their lives. These were Navy veterans who had faced death countless times, but institutional fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of reporting failure, fear of bringing shame to the Emperor. He teleported to the bridge. Crew members screamed. Weapons officers drew lost pistols. The ship's commissar, a grim man in a black coat, his authority absolute, raised his bolt pistol with practiced efficiency, and fired 3 rounds directly at Manhattan's center mass. The explosive bolts passed through him, detonated against the rear bulkhead, killed 2 junior officers, and wounded a servitor. Cease fire. Captain Thorne shouted, her voice cutting through panic. Weapons down now. The commissar kept his bolt pistol raised but stopped firing, his jaw tight with controlled fury. Around the bridge, crew members stared at Manhattan with expressions ranging from terror to religious fervor. Several were making the sign of the Aquila, crossed hands over their chests, the double-headed eagle symbol of imperial faith. Identify yourself, Captain Thorne commanded, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. I am Dr. Jonathan Ostman, Manhattan said. I mean no harm to your crew. You materialized on my ship without authorization. That is an act of war. Thorne's augmetic clicked as she stepped closer, her authority radiating from her despite being entirely outmatched. Are you Xenos, demon? Some new chaos horror? I am human in origin. I exist beyond your categories. Nothing exists beyond imperial categories. The commissar interjected, his bolt pistol still trained on Manhattan. You are enemy or ally, heretic or faithful. There is no middle ground. Manhattan looked at the commissar. Saw his name was Drac Moors. Saw his history of summary executions for cowardice and heresy. Saw his absolute conviction that the Imperium's brutal methods were humanity's only salvation. In the commissar's worldview, Manhattan was already condemned. The only question was which form of heresy he represented. Where is the ship traveling? Manhattan asked. That is classified Imperial Navy information. Thorne replied sharply. Information I will not share with potential hostile entities. Manhattan accessed the ship's cogitator banks, reading their mission parameters directly from data storage crystals. The undaunted resolve was bound for the Cassius system, responding to distress signals from the mining colony on Croesus. The signals had cut off days ago. Standard protocol demanded investigation and if necessary reclamation or purging operations. Croesus IV Manhattan said your colony stopped transmitting. You expect chaos incursion or Xenos attack. Thorne's face went pale. How do you know that? I read your ship's data cores. Your mission is a rescue operation with high probability of becoming recovery of remains. That is heresy. Commissar Moores stepped forward, his bolt pistol now pressed against the back of a junior officer's head, the standard method of enforcing discipline through implied threat. Unauthorized access to Imperial systems is grounds for immediate execution. You cannot execute me, Manhattan said simply. Your weapons don't work. I exist in a configuration that makes conventional harm impossible. Then we will find unconventional methods. He could have transported everyone instantly. But Vin's desperate plea for staggered arrival to prevent panic among Hadrian's rest authorities taught him another painful lesson in human psychology. Unprecedented miracles bred terror, while gradual impossibilities bred only suspicion. The first wave consisted of weeping children and their terrified families. 2,000 people appearing in Hadrian's Rest's primary landing zone, dazed and trembling, but miraculously alive. Planetary defense forces surrounded them instantly, weapons thrust forward, snarling for explanations. The refugees had none that made any rational sense. They babbled of glowing blue giants, frozen Necrons, vanished dark Eldar. Their frantic stories sounded like feverish dreams or profound chaos corruption. Manhattan observed from the cold void, his perception torn between Croesus IV and Hadrian's Rest. He watched PDF officers brutally interrogate sobbing children. Watched families ripped apart for corruption screening. Watched the ruthless machinery of imperial bureaucracy grind into merciless motion. On Crisis IV, Sergeant Vin stood with the second wave, watching Manhattan with weary, calculating eyes. "You're sending us to interrogation," she stated, her voice hollow. "Possibly execution. You know this?" "Yes. And you consider this salvation?" "I consider it cold probability. Most will survive. Without intervention, all would die. The cruel mathematics favor evacuation." "Mathematics?" Vin shook her head, her voice thick with despair. "You reduce everything to numbers. But humans aren't numbers, stranger. We're stories, hopes, fears, things that can't be calculated." "I calculate quite well," Manhattan replied, his tone chillingly empty. "But I acknowledge your point. My understanding of humanity may be fatally incomplete despite perfect knowledge of its physical components." The Necron warriors remained frozen, their optical senses blazing with malevolent green fire, but their bodies locked in absolute temporal stasis. Precious minutes remained before Manhattan's effect expired. The Tomb Lord, still trapped in its command node, endlessly attempted override protocols. Its ancient consciousness experiencing something horrifyingly close to pure, undiluted fury for the first time in millions of years. "Why are you doing this?" Vin begged, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "Not the philosophical justification, the actual reason." Manhattan was silent for a long, agonizing moment, processing the question. Why was he intervening? He had come to observe, to understand why humanity survived against impossible odds. Observation required distance, objectivity, non-interference. Yet he had frozen Necrons, driven off Dark Eldar, saved colonists from certain death. The undaunted resolve, he said finally, a flicker of genuine regret in his voice. "Captain Thorne chose glorious death over accepting my help. Her crew followed her into fiery oblivion. Their sacrifice taught me that observation alone provides incomplete data. I must test whether intervention produces superior outcomes. So, we're an experiment. All conscious beings are experiments in survival. I simply acknowledge it explicitly rather than pretending otherwise." Vin laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "At least you're honest about using us. The Imperium claims to serve humanity while grinding us into paste. You admit you're curiously detached. I almost respect the terrifying honesty." Manhattan transported the second wave. 3,000 colonists, including Vin, materializing in Hadrian's Rest's secondary landing zone. PDF forces surrounded them immediately, and the brutal interrogations began with practiced efficiency. He returned to Crisis IV where the final wave waited. 5,000 people, mostly miners and industrial workers, their faces scarred by decades of labor in toxic environments. They stared at him with expressions ranging from pure terror to grim resignation. Their lives had been brutal before this crisis. They expected unrelenting brutality after. "Are you a god?" one asked. An elderly miner missing 3 fingers from industrial accidents. His lungs ravaged by promethium exposure. "No." "Are you a demon?" "No." "Then what are you?" "I am what remains when humanity evolves beyond its current limitations. I am proof that transcendence is possible." The miner processed this, his weary eyes narrowing, then spat on the ground with profound contempt. "Transcendence. Fancy word for abandoning what makes us human. You glow and move like thought. But you've forgotten what it means to bleed, to hurt, to die. You're not evolved. You're just profoundly lonely." Manhattan stared at the old man, processing the accusation a deep, unsettling stillness. Lonely? Was he lonely? He existed in perfect understanding of physical reality, could perceive across timelines and dimensions, comprehended the universe at quantum levels. How could such comprehensive awareness breed loneliness? Yet the miner's words resonated with a painful, aching truth. Manhattan had abandoned physical form, transcended human limitation, achieved something approaching godhood, and in doing so, he had lost connection to the beings he had once been part of. He was no longer human. Despite his human origin, he was other, profoundly, eternally alone in his otherness. "Perhaps you are correct," Manhattan said quietly, the admission feeling like a shattering confession. The miner seemed shocked by his admission, but said nothing more, his defiant spirit spent. Manhattan transported the final wave, then remained on Crisis IV utterly alone, surrounded only by frozen Necron warriors and the mangled corpses of those who hadn't survived the initial assault. He walked through the empty colony, observing its architecture with a new, sorrowful clarity. Industrial facilities built for maximum efficiency, minimal comfort. Hab blocks where families lived in spaces smaller than prison cells. Work areas where humans labored until their bodies failed, then were coldly recycled into resources for the next generation. Everything was optimized for production. Nothing was allocated for joy. This was the Imperium in miniature. A civilization that had sacrificed everything beautiful to survive, then forgotten why survival mattered in the first place. The Necron warriors unfroze. Temporal stasis expired, and the warriors' consciousness reconnected to their bodies. They resumed their previous activities as though no interruption had occurred, advancing through the colony, scanning for resources, calculating extraction efficiency. They registered that all human signatures had vanished, but reassigned priorities rather than investigating. Humans were irrelevant variables. Resources were the only mission. The Tomb Lord emerged from its command node, its necrodermis body towering menacingly, ornate designs carved into its living metal. It saw Manhattan immediately, the only anomalous presence remaining in the colony, and approached with mechanical, inexorable patience. "You are unclassified," the Tomb Lord stated. Its voice was a synthesized horror of subharmonics that bypassed auditory systems to vibrate directly in bone. Biological signature inconsistent, energy signature unprecedented. Threat assessment indeterminate. "I am observing your operations," Manhattan replied. "Observation does not explain interference. You removed human livestock. You imposed temporal stasis on Necron forces. These actions constitute hostile engagement. I prevented unnecessary deaths. Your harvest operations can proceed without human casualties." The Tomb Lord processed this, its ancient consciousness running through decision trees that predated human civilization. Human presence is irrelevant to harvest efficiency. Your intervention was unnecessary. Precisely. Your mission and human survival were not mutually exclusive. Yet you would have killed them regardless. Obstacles are removed. This is protocol. Even when obstacles can remove themselves at no cost to your mission. The Tomb Lord was silent, its optical sensors focusing on Manhattan with what might have been cold, mechanical curiosity or might have been lethal targeting calculation. You argue for efficiency while defending inefficient biological entities. This is paradoxical. I argue that efficiency should account for all variables, including moral considerations that biological entities value. Morality is not a physical variable. Yet it affects outcomes. The humans I saved will remember this encounter. Some will question why their gods allowed suffering while an outsider intervened. Others will create theological justifications. These psychological effects ripple through their civilization, creating changes that affect future interactions with your forces. Morality is physical because consciousness is physical. The Tomb Lord processed this for several seconds, an eternity for machine cognition. Your logic contains merit. However, Necron protocols were established millions of years ago. I cannot modify core programming without authorization from the Silent King who has not communicated for millennia. So, you acknowledge the logic, but cannot act on it. Correct. I am bound by ancient directives that no longer account for current galactic complexity. The Tomb Lord gestured with one metallic hand toward the empty colony, a gesture of profound, ancient futility. This situation has repeated across thousands of worlds. Necron forces engage biological entities in conflicts where no conflict is necessary. Resources are harvested. Biologicals die. Neither side benefits from the deaths. Yet deaths occur because protocols demand it. Manhattan perceived something unexpected in the Tomb Lord's quantum signature. Not quite emotion, but something approximating a ghost of regret. The ancient consciousness had been alive once, millions of years ago, before biotransference had imprisoned it in necrodermis. It had been a warrior, a leader, perhaps even someone who had made choices based on more than protocol. Now it was machinery wearing the ghost of consciousness, unable to question the programming that defined its existence. "You were human once," Manhattan said. "Not this species, but something analogous, biological, mortal. I was Necronter. We were weak, dying. The Stan offered immortality through biotransference. We accepted. Our consciousness was transferred to necrodermis bodies. Our mortality traded for eternal servitude to protocols we no longer control. You regret the choice. I cannot regret. Regret requires emotional capacity. I acknowledge only that biotransference produced outcomes contrary to our original intentions. We sought to escape death. Instead, we became incapable of life. Manhattan and the Tomb Lord stood among the ruins of human civilization, two post-biological entities discussing the bitter price of transcendence. The irony was not lost on Manhattan. He had transcended human limitation voluntarily, while the Necronter had been deceived into it. Yet both now existed outside the biological context that gave life meaning. What would you do? Manhattan asked. If you could override your programming? Unknown. I have operated under protocol for so long that independent choice has become theoretical concept rather than practical capability. The Tomb Lord paused, its optical sensors dimming. What would you do if you could restore your biological limitations? Manhattan considered the question with a depth of feeling that surprised him. Return to being Jonathan Ostman, fragile, mortal, bound by time's linear progression. The thought was both terrifying and strangely, achingly appealing. As a human, he had experienced uncertainty, emotional connection, the terrible weight of consequence. As Dr. Manhattan, he had gained infinite power and lost something essential. I would experience doubt again, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Uncertainty, the weight of choices made without perfect foresight. These limitations sound inefficient. They are what made me human, what made existence meaningful beyond mere function. The Tomb Lord's optical senses flickered, a sign of immense internal processing. Perhaps this is why biologicals persist despite their weaknesses. Meaning requires uncertainty. Purpose requires mortality. We Necrons lost both in achieving immortality. You have lost both in achieving transcendence. The biologicals we dismiss as inferior retain what we have sacrificed. Manhattan departed Crasis IV, leaving the Tomb Lord to continue its harvest operations in an empty colony. He teleported to Hadrian's Rest, materializing in the interrogation center where evacuated colonists were being processed. The facility was brutal efficiency-made architecture. Gray rockcrete walls, harsh lighting, rows of interrogation chambers where inquisitorial agents and their subordinates extracted truth through psychological pressure, chemical enhancement, and occasionally psychic intrusion. The colonists were being processed like cargo, each Nate catalogued, questioned, tested for corruption with cold, impersonal rigor. Manhattan walked through walls, observing unseen. In one chamber, a child sobbed while an interrogator demanded she describe the glowing demon that had transported her. In another, Sergeant Vin sat stone-faced as a sanctioned psyker rifled through her memories, searching for chaos taint. In a third, the elderly miner, who had called Manhattan lonely, was being subjected to a purity test, blessed water on his skin. Prayers recited to measure his reaction, his every twitch analyzed for signs of corruption. Most would pass. Manhattan had healed their physical injuries, but left their minds intact, their memories genuine, their souls untouched by any power that imperial theology could classify as heretical. They would be released eventually, marked as survivors of Xeno's attack. Their rescue attributed to the Emperor's grace manifesting through unknown means. But some would not pass. Not because of genuine corruption, but because imperial paranoia demanded sacrifice. Every unexplained phenomenon required blood payment, a message sent to the broader populace. Contact with the unknown meant punishment even for the innocent. Manhattan observed an interrogator mark 3 colonists for execution. Arbitrary choices selected because their stories were too detailed, their survival too improbable, their presence during Manhattan's intervention too direct. They would be executed as a precaution, their bodies burned, their names stricken from record. He could prevent this, teleport the condemned to safety, continue his pattern of intervention. But intervention had consequences. Every life he saved created ripples, complications. Future events he couldn't fully predict. Despite his quantum awareness, the Imperium's brutality was systemic. Removing individuals from punishment didn't reform the system. It just redistributed suffering unless he changed the system itself. Manhattan materialized in Hadrian's Rest's command center, appearing before Governor Marcus Vale, a man whose family had ruled this fortress world for generations. His authority absolute within its borders, his loyalty to the Imperium unquestioned. Vale's personal guards opened fire immediately. Bolt pistols, plasma weapons, even an archaic power sword swung at Manhattan's neck, all passed through him harmlessly. When the futility of their attack became apparent, the guards stood back, weapons raised but useless, their training unable to account for an enemy that couldn't be harmed. "Identify yourself," Vale commanded, his augmetic eye flickering with cold fury as it recorded the encounter. "By whose authority do you violate my command center? I am Dr. Jonathan Osterman. I require no authority beyond my own capability." "Here. Sigh," Vale hissed, his face contorting with rage. "You claim authority outside the Emperor's chain of command. That is the first principle of rebellion. I claim nothing. I simply state reality. I have transported colonists from Crasis IV to your world. They are being interrogated, tested, processed through your security apparatus. 3 have been marked for execution despite being innocent of any crime. The Inquisition's agents marked them, not I. Their judgment is beyond my authority." Vale leaned back in his command throne, attempting to project confidence despite obvious, seething fear. "If you object to imperial justice, you object to the Emperor's will. That makes you an enemy of humanity. I object to inefficiency masquerading as justice. The 3 marked for execution pose no threat. Their deaths serve no purpose beyond satisfying paranoid doctrine. All doctrine is paranoid in the 41st millennium," Vale replied, his voice dripping with venom. "Because the threats we face are real. Chaos corruption spreads through a single infected individual. Genestealer cults hide among loyal populations. Dark Eldar sleeper agents integrate into human society. We burn innocents occasionally because failing to burn the guilty once results in planetary extinction." Manhattan perceived the terrible truth in Vale's words. The Imperium's paranoia wasn't irrational. It was an adaptive response to genuine existential threats. They had learned through terrible experience that trust was lethal, that mercy enabled corruption, that small risks metastasized into apocalyptic failures. "So you acknowledge that innocents die to prevent possible future corruption?" Manhattan said, his voice flat. "I acknowledge that we sacrifice the few to save the many. This is the burden of command." Vale gestured toward tactical displays showing Hadrian's Rest's defenses, gun emplacements, orbital platforms, garrison forces, a sweeping gesture of desperate power. "I maintain a population of millions through vigilance. If I must burn 3 refugees to ensure no corruption enters my world, I consider it a tragic necessity rather than a moral failure. And if I told you I can guarantee those 3 pose no threat, that I have examined them at the quantum level and found no corruption, I would ask what price you demand for such a guarantee. And I would refuse regardless because accepting verification from unknown entities is how civilizations fall to damnation." Vale stood, his ceremonial armor whirring. "You appeared in my command center through unknown means. You claim impossible knowledge. You interfere with imperial justice. Every aspect of your presence screams potential corruption, even if your intentions appear benevolent. So, I am condemned regardless of actual threat. You unclassifiable, which makes you a threat by definition. The Imperium has survived 10,000 years by assuming all unknowns are hostile until proven otherwise, and even then remaining suspicious." Manhattan processed this circular, suffocating logic. The Imperium couldn't trust him because they didn't understand him. They couldn't understand him because they refused to investigate anything that contradicted their theology. Their theology forbade investigation because knowledge outside approved doctrine was heretical. The system was self-reinforcing, designed to reject external input, no matter how beneficial. "I could force compliance," Manhattan said quietly, the statement hanging in the air like a threat. "Reconstruct your neural patterns to remove paranoia. Reshape your command structure to prioritize evidence over doctrine. Transform your civilization into something more rational." Vale's face went pale, but his voice remained steady, filled with a defiant pride. "Then you would be no different from chaos. The ruinous powers promise perfection through transformation. They offer to remove humanity's flaws, reshape consciousness according to their vision. We reject them because forced perfection is damnation by another name. I am not chaos. No, you're something potentially worse. Chaos tempts and corrupts. We have learned to resist temptation. You offer rational solutions to genuine problems, which makes your offer seductive to those who think rather than feel. You are heresy wrapped in logic. Damnation disguised as enlightenment." Manhattan had not expected this comparison. Vale had identified something Manhattan himself had not consciously acknowledged, that his interventions, however beneficial in immediate terms, represented cultural imperialism. He was attempting to reshape a civilization according to his values, using overwhelming power to bypass consent. The Imperium was brutal, inefficient, horrifically unjust. But it was also theirs. Humanity's response to impossible circumstances refined over millennia of desperate survival. Manhattan's improvements would make it his creation rather than theirs, stripping them of agency in favor of his superior judgment. He had made this mistake before in his own universe. He had tried to save Earth from nuclear war through demonstration of power. And his intervention had nearly caused the very catastrophe he sought to prevent. He had learned that imposing solutions, even correct solutions, created dependency and resentment. The Imperium had to save itself or any salvation was meaningless. You make a compelling argument, Manhattan said finally, conceding with a heavy heart. Vale seemed surprised. You concede? I acknowledge the validity of your position. Forced improvement is tyranny regardless of outcome. The Imperium must choose its own evolution, not have it imposed by external force. Then why are you here? Vale demanded, his anger giving way to confusion. What do you want from us? Manhattan considered the question. What did he want? He had come to observe, to understand why humanity survived. He had learned that survival came at a tremendous cost, brutality, paranoia, endless suffering refined into doctrine. He had intervened to test whether his power could reduce that cost, only to discover that intervention created its own problems. I want to understand whether your civilization can evolve beyond its current configuration, he said finally, his voice filled with a strange longing. Whether humanity can retain what makes it human while transcending the brutality that survival has demanded. And if you can't, if you're locked in this pattern forever, then I will observe your extinction when it eventually comes, and I will understand why power without wisdom leads to inevitable collapse. Vale laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You speak of our extinction as a distant curiosity. This is why you will never understand humanity, stranger. We don't observe our own deaths from a safe distance. We fight, we rage, we sacrifice everything to postpone the end one more day. That is what makes us human. Not our nobility or wisdom, but our stubborn, furious refusal to accept inevitable doom. Manhattan perceived the raw, desperate truth in Vale's words. Humans didn't calculate probability and accept logical outcomes. They fought against mathematics itself, choosing defiance over acceptance, hope over despair. Even when hope was demonstrably irrational, it was illogical. It was wasteful. It was magnificent in its absolute, furious refusal to submit. Your 3 condemned colonists, Manhattan said. Will you spare them? No, Vale replied, his voice hard as iron. Because doing so after your intervention would prove I can be manipulated through external pressure. Better to execute 3 innocents than establish precedent that unknowns can dictate my decisions. So they die to prove your independence from my influence. They die because the Imperium's survival requires us to make terrible choices consistently rather than kind choices occasionally. If I spare them today, tomorrow's interrogator spares someone genuinely corrupted out of misplaced mercy. And next month my world burns. Manhattan saw Vale's timelines. In most, he ruled for years before dying in an invasion. His final act ordering orbital bombardment on his own capital rather than let it fall to Xenos. In some he was assassinated by political rivals who considered him too moderate. In a few, he died quietly of age. His successor continuing his policies without deviation. In none of them did he betray the principles that defined him. You are a good man trapped in a bad system, Manhattan observed, a note of pity in his tone. I am a loyal servant trapped in a doomed galaxy, Vale corrected, his pride a shield against the horror. There's a difference. Good men have the luxury of acting on principle. I have only the responsibility of maintaining order while everything collapses. If that makes me bad, so be it. I will answer to the Emperor when I die, and his judgment is the only one that matters. Manhattan left Hadrian's Rest without preventing the executions. He watched from orbit as 3 innocent colonists were put to death. Quick loss rounds to the head, their bodies incinerated, their names erased from record. They died so the system could demonstrate its grim consistency, so paranoia could maintain its stranglehold, so the Imperium could continue grinding forward through sacrifice. He had the power to save them. He chose not to because Vale's terrible logic was sound. Intervention would establish precedent that external forces could dictate imperial decisions. Every life Manhattan saved would weaken humanity's self-determination, replacing their agency with his judgment. But not intervening meant accepting preventable deaths. Deaths that served no tactical purpose, protected no one, accomplished nothing beyond reinforcing a brutal doctrine. There was no correct choice, only different kinds of soul-crushing failure. Morse turned to Captain Thorne, his face a mask of frantic urgency. "Captain, I recommend an immediate jump to the warp. We file reports with the Inquisition and let them handle this abomination." Thorne hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her duty was agonizingly clear. Unknown entities on Imperial vessels required immediate reporting, but something about this glowing figure screamed that fleeing wouldn't help. If it could teleport aboard her ship mid-transit, it could follow them through the warp. And if they reported this encounter, the Inquisition might declare the entire ship compromised and order its ruthless destruction. "What do you want?" she asked Manhattan directly, her voice strained. "To observe your mission. Your colony is in danger. I want to see how the Imperium responds to threats. We don't require observers." Morse snapped, his voice dripping with venom. "We require faith, discipline, and the Emperor's blessing." Manhattan looked at the Commissar, then at Captain Thorne, then at the bridge crew frozen in various states of panic and confusion. These people lived their entire lives inside this ship. A self-contained world of military hierarchy, religious ritual, and absolute obedience. Most had never set foot on a planetary surface. Many had been born aboard Navy vessels, their families say. RVing for generations, their lives dedicated to a mission they could barely comprehend. "I will not interfere with your operations," Manhattan said. "I will simply observe, and if your crew faces danger, I will consider whether intervention serves the greater understanding of your civilization." "We don't need your consideration," Thorne said, her voice hard as steel. "We serve the Emperor. We don't require salvation from glowing strangers." "Your colony does," Manhattan replied. He accessed the ship's long-range auger data, processing signals that human technology struggled to interpret. "I perceive Cassius IV across multiple spectrums. The colony is under attack. Not chaos, not Xenos. Something you would not recognize." "What else?" Thorne demanded, her patience fraying. Manhattan was silent for a moment, his perception stretching across the void to the embattled mining world. He saw industrial facilities burning. He saw colonists fleeing through underground tunnels. He saw automated defense systems firing at targets that didn't register properly on their sensors. And he saw the attackers. "Necrons," he said finally. The word dropped into the bridge like a live grenade. Thorne's face went from pale to ashen. Junior officers began whispering frantic prayers. Even Commissar Morse lowered his bolt pistol fractionally, his absolute confidence deeply shaken. "The Undying," Thorne whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Ancient Xenos machine skeletons animated by technology our Mechanicus can barely comprehend." She turned to her second-in-command, her movements stiff. "Update tactical assessment. Prepare for Necron engagement protocols. And someone get me confirmation from the astropathic choir. We need reinforcements." "Reinforcements will not arrive in time," Manhattan observed, his tone chillingly calm. "Your colony has hours before the Necrons complete their harvest operations." "Harvest?" Thorne looked at him sharply, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "They're taking prisoners?" "No, they're taking the planet's mineral resources. The colonists are simply in the way. Irrelevant obstacles to be removed efficiently." Manhattan paused, processing data with inhuman speed. Approximately 15,000 humans remain alive in the colony. The Necron force consists of warriors, immortals, destroyers, and one tomb lord coordinating the operation. They are methodical, efficient, and entirely without mercy. "How do you know this?" Morse demanded, his voice cracking with fury. "I can see them through the planet's crust, through their necrodermis bodies into the quantum structures that animate dead metal." Manhattan turned to face Captain Thorne directly, his gaze intense. "Your ship cannot save them. You lack the firepower to defeat even a minor Necron force. If you TTEMPT intervention, the Necrons will destroy your vessel and continue their operations without interruption." A heavy, despairing silence fell over the bridge. Officers exchanged terrified glances, their training warring with growing despair. They had signed on to serve the Emperor, to die for humanity if necessary. But dying uselessly was different from dying in service to a greater purpose. "You're suggesting we abandon 15,000 Imperial citizens," Thorne said slowly, each word a struggle. I'm stating tactical reality. Your ship represents personnel. Sacrificing them to fail at saving others is poor mathematics. Mathematics? Thorn's voice filled with bitter contempt. You reduce human lives to numbers, to calculations. That is the thinking of machines, not men. It is the thinking your civilization practices constantly, Manhattan countered, utterly unmoved. Entire worlds are sacrificed through exterminatus to save sectors. Billions die in grinding wars to preserve the Imperium's borders. Your commanders calculate acceptable losses in every engagement. I simply state openly what your hierarchy practices in secret. Commissar Morse stepped forward, his bolt pistol now aimed at Captain Thorn's head, his eyes burning with fanatical fire. Captain Thorn, I hear doubt in your voice. Doubt is the gateway to heresy. We proceed to Cassius IV and execute our mission. If we die in service, we die with honor. Thorn stared at Manhattan, her jaw tight, her mind racing through impossible, soul-crushing calculations. She knew he was right. Her ship couldn't defeat Necrons. But abandoning Imperial citizens without even attempting rescue violated every oath she'd sworn. The Commissar would execute her for cowardice if she turned away. The Inquisition would condemn her crew if they fled. There was no good choice. Only the least terrible option. We proceed to Cassius IV, she said finally, her voice heavy with resignation. Prepare for combat operations. And you? She pointed at Manhattan, her finger trembling with suppressed emotion. If you're truly here to observe, then observe. Watch how humanity faces impossible odds. Watch how we die, defying the darkness. Manhattan inclined his head slightly, a gesture of cold acknowledgement. I will watch, and I will consider whether your deaths serve any purpose beyond satisfying doctrine. Our purpose, Thorn said coldly, is not subject to your consideration. She turned away, barking orders to her crew, preparing her ship for a battle she knew would likely be her last. And Manhattan stood at the center of the bridge, glowing softly in the harsh lights, an observer at the edge of humanity's endless, bloody war. The undaunted resolve entered the Cassius system hours later, its Geller field collapsing as the ship tore back into real space with the violent shudder that always accompanied warp translation. Crew members crossed themselves and muttered prayers of desperate thanks to the Emperor for another successful journey through hell. Manhattan had spent those hours observing the ship's internal operations. He walked through crew quarters where families lived in cramped, suffocating compartments. 3 generations, sometimes sharing a single room. He stood in the engineering decks where reactor crews worked in lethal radiation environments, their lifespans measured in years rather than decades. Their sacrifice considered acceptable for the ship's function. He watched the astropathic choir, blind psychers whose minds were bound to the warp, screaming silently as they transmitted messages across the void, each transmission burning away a portion of their sanity. The undaunted resolve was not merely a warship. It was a microcosm of imperial civilization, brutal hierarchy, religious ritual masking technical operation, lives spent in service to machinery that predated their grandparents and would outlive their grandchildren. Now the ship's auger array swept across the Cassius system, gathering tactical data. 4 planets, the sensor officer reported, his voice tense. Gracias IV is third from the sun. Mining world. Population 15,000. Primary export is promethium and rare earth elements. No response to hails. Multiple structures show damage. Detecting energy signatures consistent with. He paused, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Confirmed Necron presence. Multiple contacts across the primary colony site. Captain Thorn stood at the center of her bridge. Her command throne elevated to provide optimal view of tactical displays. Around her, officers worked with practiced efficiency, their fear sublimated into grim duty. Tactical assessment, she commanded, her voice like iron. Necron forces are concentrated in 3 locations, the tactical officer replied, his servo-skull assistant projecting holographic images above the display table. Primary colony site shows warriors in systematic sweep patterns. Secondary site, the mining facility, shows immortals extracting resources. Tertiary site appears to be a central command node, possibly housing their command unit. Human survivors scattered throughout the underground tunnel networks. Thousands of signatures. Heat blooms suggest they're hiding in maintenance corridors and emergency shelters. The officer looked up, his face grim. They won't last long. The Necrons are methodical. They'll breach every shelter within hours. Thorne's jaw tightened. Hours. Not enough time for reinforcements. Barely enough time for evacuation, if evacuation were even possible against Necron forces. Launch pattern? She asked. Standard Necron harvest operation, the tactical officer replied. They want the planet's resources, not territory. Once they extract what they need, they'll likely withdraw. The human presence is incidental. They're killing colonists because humans are in the way, not because they particularly care about eliminating us. How efficient of them, Commissar Morse said darkly. To die is an afterthought rather than an enemy. Manhattan stood at the edge of the bridge, observing the holographic displays. The Necron forces moved with chilling mechanical precision, their formations optimized for resource extraction rather than conquest. They were harvesting promethium reservoirs, stripping rare minerals from the planet's crust, processing everything through matter reconstitution technology that the Mechanicus would consider sacred mysteries. The Tomb Lord coordinating the operation was ancient. Manhattan perceived its consciousness, if consciousness was the correct term. A mind that had been alive millions of years ago, transferred into undying metal, forced to serve protocols it no longer questioned because questioning had been engineered out of its cognitive functions. It didn't hate humanity. It didn't feel anything. It simply executed its programming with the patience of immortal machinery. Captain, Manhattan said, his voice cutting through tactical discussions. Your ship cannot defeat this force. If you engage, you will be destroyed. Thorne turned to face him, her expression hard as stone. Are you suggesting retreat? I'm stating probability. Your weapons are insufficient. Your shields will fail under sustained Gauss fire. Your crew will die and the colonists will die anyway. Then what do you suggest? Thorne's voice carried an edge of raw desperation beneath the command authority. Stand by and watch. Let Imperial citizens die without even attempting rescue. I suggest you consider whether your deaths serve tactical purpose or merely satisfy doctrine. Commissar Morse moved his hand to his bolt pistol, his face contorted with rage. Defeatism is heresy. Captain Thorne, I recommend we ignore this entity's counsel and proceed with standard engagement protocols. Thorne looked at her tactical displays at the Necron formations, at the scattered heat signatures of terrified colonists huddling in darkness. Every fiber of her training demanded action. Every oath she'd sworn required her to fight. But Manhattan's cold assessment gnawed at her. Dying uselessly didn't serve the Emperor. It just added more corpses to the galaxy's count. How would you save them? She asked Manhattan, her voice barely a whisper. If you were in command, what would you do? I would teleport all surviving colonists to your ship's cargo holds, then destroy the Necron F. Force through molecular disassembly, Manhattan replied, his tone utterly matter-of-fact. The operation would take minutes. The bridge fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Officers stared at Manhattan, processing the staggering implications. He could save everyone effortlessly without casualties, without the heroic sacrifice that Imperial doctrine demanded. Why haven't you? Thorne asked, her voice trembling. Because I am observing, not intervening. Your civilization operates according to specific principles. If I circumvent those principles, I learn nothing about why they exist. You would let people die to satisfy your curiosity. Thorne's voice filled with barely contained, furious rage. You would sacrifice to satisfy your doctrine, Manhattan countered, his calm a stark contrast to her fury. We both allow deaths for abstract reasons. The difference is I acknowledge the choice. Morse drew his bolt pistol completely now, aiming at Thorne's head again, his standard, terrifying intimidation tactic. Captain, we have our orders. We engage. If we die serving the Emperor. That is enough. Thorne looked at her crew. Young faces, old faces, men and women who had trusted her command, who believed in the Imperium's cause, even when that cause ground them into dust. They deserved better than a futile last stand against immortal machines. But the Imperium didn't deal in deserved, only in duty. All hands to battle stations, she ordered, her voice steady despite the crushing weight of command. Prepare attack pattern Delta 7. Target priority. Destroy the Tomb Lord's command node. If we can disrupt their coordination, perhaps the colonists can. Captain, the officer's voice cracked with panic. New contact. Massive energy signature translating from the warp at system's edge. Every head turned toward the tactical display. A new holographic image materialized. A ship but not Imperial design. Xenos architecture. cruel barbed structures. Dark metal that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Dark Eldar, Throne whispered, her face going pale with terror. Throne of Terra. We're not just facing Necrons. The Drukhari are here, too. Manhattan perceived the new arrival instantly. A Dark Eldar raiding vessel, its holds empty, its crew hungry for slaves and suffering. They had detected the mining colony's distress, seen the Necron assault, and decided to exploit the chaos. While the Necrons methodically harvested resources, the Dark Eldar would harvest souls, taking surviving humans back to Kamora for torture, slavery, and eventual consumption. The Cassius system had just become a battleground for three factions, and the human colonists were the prize none of them particularly valued. New tactical assessment, the tactical officer said, High's voice hollow with shock. Dark Eldar vessel is launching boarding craft toward the colony. They're not engaging the Necrons. They're racing them, trying to capture colonists before the Necrons kill them all. How many boarding craft? Thorn demanded, her voice tight. Confirmed. Raider class. Approximately Drukhari warriors total. Thorn slumped back into her command throne. The weight of impossible decisions crushed down on her. Fight the Necrons and die. Fight the Dark Eldar and die. Fight both and die faster. Retreat and let colonists suffer fates worse than death. Either disintegration by Necrons or eternal torture by Drukhari. There was no good choice. There never was in the 41st millennium. Captain, Manhattan said quietly, I could resolve this situation. Eliminate both threats. Save your crew and the colonists. At what cost? Thorn asked bitterly. What does a god demand for miracles? Nothing. I would do it because I can. Because it is within my capability and requires negligible effort. And in exchange, we what? Worship you? Add you to the Imperium's pantheon of false idols. Thorn shook her head, her eyes filled with a desperate, furious faith. The Emperor is humanity's only salvation. Accepting aid from unknown entities is how civilizations fall to chaos. I am not chaos. You are something we don't understand, which makes you dangerous. Thorn stood, her augmetic clicking. I would rather die fighting by the Emperor's doctrine than live through your intervention. At least in death, I know I served faithfully. Manhattan looked at her, saw her conviction, her fear, her desperate need to believe that suffering had meaning. She would die here. Her crew would die. The colonists would die or worse. All because doctrine demanded purity over pragmatism, faith over survival. And yet he understood. The Imperium had taught its citizens that accepting help from unknown powers led to damnation. They had seen it happen. Chaos cultists who accepted demon gifts. Xenos collaborators who betrayed humanity. AI rebellions that nearly destroyed civilization. Their paranoia was justified by history. Trust nothing. Suspect everything. Die faithful rather than live corrupted. It was insane. It was also terrifyingly, possibly correct. Then I will continue observing, Manhattan said. And when your ship is destroyed, when your crew is dead, when the colonists are enslaved or disintegrated, I will watch and understand why you chose this outcome. Thorn met his glowing eyes, her own blazing with defiant pride. Perhaps the lesson you need to learn, Doctor, is that some choices are worth dying for, even when wiser alternatives exist. She turned back to her tactical displays, issuing orders with calm authority. All batteries prepare to fire on D. Arc Eldar boarding craft. Weapons crew's target priority is saving colonists from capture. If we can't defeat the Necrons, we can at least deny the Drukhari their prize. For the Emperor, Commissar Morse shouted, and the bridge crew echoed the cry, their voices filling the command center with desperate, defiant faith. Manhattan stood among them, a blue ghost in the machinery of war, and watched humanity choose death over compromise. Thorn's sacrifice, the Emperor's warning. Every imperial authority he'd encountered had made the same heartbreaking point. Accepting his help meant surrendering their very souls, becoming dependent on power they couldn't control or even comprehend. I do not seek to replace your Emperor, Manhattan said, his voice echoing with a strange, hollow sorrow. I seek to understand why you choose suffering when alternatives exist. Because choosing your alternatives means surrendering our humanity, Ortega replied sharply, his eyes burning with fierce pride. The Emperor is human. Superhuman, yes, but born of Terra, shaped by human struggle, dedicated to human survival through human means. You are other, post-human, beyond human. If we accept your miracles, we become servants of something that stopped being human when it stopped being vulnerable. Vulnerability, Manhattan said quietly, the word tasting like ash. You define humanity through capacity for harm. We define humanity through capacity for choice in the face of harm, Ortega corrected, his voice trembling with fervent conviction. If you remove all threats, all dangers, all consequences, what decisions remain? What separates humans from servitors if every problem is solved through external intervention? Manhattan perceived the profound philosophical trap he had walked into. The Imperium didn't reject his help because they preferred suffering. They rejected it because suffering was the sacred context in which their choices mattered. Remove suffering and choice became abstract exercise. Life became curated experience rather than genuine, bloody existence. They needed the possibility of failure to give success meaning. They needed the threat of death to make survival valuable. They needed uncertainty to make certainty worth achieving. The millions will die, Manhattan observed, the weight of each life crushing his spirit. Yes, Ortega's voice was grim, yet filled with a terrible resolve. And we will mourn them. And we will remember their sacrifice. And we will continue fighting because their deaths demand we make their sacrifice meaningful by surviving. Ortega gestured toward tactical displays showing the advancing Tyranid fleet, a tide of inevitable doom. This is what you fail to understand, Dr. Ostman. We know most of us will die. We accept this. We even embrace it because accepting death's inevitability frees us to focus on life's importance. The Tyranids will consume this sector, Manhattan said, the certainty of it a cold stone in his gut. Your forces cannot defeat them and the orcs simultaneously. You face guaranteed extinction within months. Probably, Ortega agreed, a grim, proud smile touching his lips. But probability isn't certainty. We've survived impossible odds before. We'll fight anyway because fighting is what defines us. And if we die fighting, we die human. If we accept your salvation, we die as something else. Comfortable, safe, meaningless. Manhattan looked at Ortega, saw his raw determination, his fear carefully suppressed beneath iron command discipline, his absolute, suicidal commitment to principles that would get him killed. The Lord Commander was choosing death over compromise, exactly as Thorn had, exactly as the Imperium consistently demanded. It was wasteful. It was irrational. It was magnificently, frustratingly human. I could save you anyway, Manhattan said, the temptation a sharp ache. Override your objections. Evacuate all threatened populations whether you consent or not. Then do it, Ortega challenged, his eyes blazing with defiant fire. Prove that your power makes our choices irrelevant. Demonstrate that resistance is futile. Become the tyrant you claim not to be. Manhattan stood in the command center surrounded by humans preparing for desperate last stands and confronted the same soul-crushing question he'd faced repeatedly. Did his power give him the right to impose salvation against their will? He had spent months observing the Imperium, witnessing its horrific brutality, documenting its staggering waste. He had seen millions die from preventable causes, watched children starve while bureaucrats shuffled requisition forms, observed soldiers executed for tactical retreats that any rational analysis would approve. The Imperium was broken, inefficient, horrifically unjust. He could fix it. His power made reform possible, could reshape their civilization into something rational and humane. But fixing them meant breaking their agency. It meant deciding their future without their consent. It meant becoming exactly what Ortega accused him of, a tyrant who imposed will through overwhelming power. No, Manhattan said finally, the word a monument to his anguish. I will not force salvation. I will observe your struggle against the Tyranids, and if you fail, I will bear witness to your extinction, knowing I chose non-interference over tyranny. Ortega's expression flickered. Surprise, perhaps respect, possibly bitter disappointment. You're either the most moral being I've encountered or the most cowardly. I can't determine which. Perhaps both, Manhattan replied. The admission tasting like gall. Morality and cowardice are often indistinguishable when viewed through pragmatic lens. He teleported from the command center, leaving Ortega to coordinate his hopeless defense. Manhattan positioned himself in high orbit above Octarius Prime, his heart a lead weight. His perception expanding to encompass the entire sector. He watched the Tyranids advance, a wave of pure consumption. Saw their bioships disgorge landing organisms. Watched them consume biomass and reproduce with terrifying speed. Perceived the hive mind's cold, alien calculation optimizing every adaptation. The Tyranids weren't cruel or evil. They simply consumed, evolving to overcome resistance, processing all biological matter into resources for further consumption. They were nature weaponized, evolution stripped of purpose beyond survival and reproduction. He watched the orcs fight back with savage joy. Saw war bosses rally their hordes. Watched greenskin technology achieve impossible functions through sheer belief. Perceived the orcs' pure, unadulterated joy in combat. They weren't fighting for survival. They fought because fighting was their purpose. Because warfare was their natural state. Because crushing enemies was how they expressed existence. They were culture weaponized, violence elevated to philosophical principle. He watched the Imperial struggle, saw tactical genius deployed against overwhelming odds, witnessed soldiers choosing death over retreat, observed commanders sacrificing millions in calculated gambits that might save billions. They fought with grim determination without orc joy or Tyranid efficiency, motivated by duty to species and faith in a distant, dying god. They were desperation weaponized, suffering refined into military doctrine. 3 factions, 3 philosophies, all converging in a sector that wouldn't survive their conflict. Manhattan perceived the probable outcomes with crushing clarity. The Imperium would evacuate perhaps a fraction of its population before defensive lines collapsed. The Tyranids would consume most of available biomass before orc resistance forced tactical withdrawal. The orcs would survive because survival was built into their genetic code, hibernating in spore form until conditions allowed resurgence. Billions of humans would die. The sector would be lost. The Imperium would record it as acceptable casualties and adjust its defensive parameters accordingly. Manhattan could prevent this, could eliminate the Tyranid fleet, neutralize the orc hordes, save every threatened human. He had done similar interventions before, frozen Necrons, driven off Dark Eldar, healed injuries, transported refugees. But each intervention had taught him the same bitter lesson. Imposed salvation was tyranny by another. Name. The Imperium had to choose its own path, fight its own battles, make its own sacrifices. His intervention would strip them of agency, reducing their struggle to theater performance where outcomes were predetermined. So he did nothing. He watched worlds fall to the Tyranids, watched millions of humans consumed and processed into biomass. He observed Octarius Prime's desperate last stand, saw Lord Commander Ortega die, commanding the rearguard action that allowed evacuation of civilians. He perceived the sector's collapse over months of grinding, soul-destroying warfare. Each world falling in sequence, billions dying in the mathematically predictable cascade of defeat. And he felt something he hadn't experienced since becoming Dr. Manhattan. Genuine, wrenching grief for deaths he could have prevented but chose not to. It hurt. Not physically. He existed beyond physical sensation, but in whatever remained of his consciousness that remembered being human. The weight of observation without intervention, of witnessing preventable tragedy and choosing inaction was its own kind of suffering. Perhaps this was what the Emperor experienced, watching from the Golden Throne as his Imperium ground forward through endless sacrifice. The agony of knowing better was possible, but accepting that imposed improvement was worse than organic failure. The price of respecting agency was accepting that agents made terrible choices. The Octarius sector burned and Manhattan bore witness and learned that godlike power without willingness to impose will was its own form of powerlessness. Manhattan spent the next decade moving through the Imperium's territories, observing countless conflicts, witnessing the slow, brutal grinding of human civilization against an uncaring galaxy. He watched Space Marine chapters prosecute crusades, observed Inquisitors purge heretical cults, witnessed Imperial Guard regiments die in wholesale slaughter across nameless worlds. He saw humanity fighting on a million fronts simultaneously, each battle a desperate holding action against entropy, and he began to perceive a pattern that his earlier observations had missed. The Imperium wasn't dying. It was adapting slowly, inefficiently, with tremendous waste and suffering, but adapting nonetheless. Chapters developed new tactics against Tyranid swarms. Forge worlds innovated around lost STC templates, creating crude replacements that barely functioned but functioned nonetheless. Administrative clerks optimized logistics through trial and error, reducing response times from decades to years. The improvement was glacial, barely perceptible across human lifespans. But Manhattan's perspective spanned centuries of observation, compressed into his timeless consciousness. He saw the evolutionary process, re-sculpting imperial culture, selecting for resilience over efficiency, survival over comfort, continuation over optimization. The Imperium was a civilization optimized for the worst-case scenario. It sacrificed everything: comfort, justice, individual welfare, scientific progress, to ensure that some fragment of humanity would survive no matter what horrors the galaxy produced. It was prepared for demonic invasion, Xenos extermination, technological rebellion, internal civil war, and simultaneous combinations of all four. And by preparing for the worst, they ensured the worst was all they ever experienced. Manhattan found himself drawn to the imperial borders, the liminal spaces where humanity's light dimmed and darkness crept in. On the eastern fringe, where Tyranid Hive fleets probed for weakness. On the Eye of Terror's edge, where chaos bled through reality's membrane. In the Ghoul stars, where unknown horrors lurked and systems that had gone silent millennia ago. These were the places where the Imperium's facade cracked, where its pretense of control dissolved into honest, raw desperation. Here, soldiers didn't fight for glory or the Emperor's grace. They fought because stopping meant death, and death meant their families died, too. On the shrine world of Cather, Manhattan observed a phenomenon he hadn't expected. Genuine faith producing tangible, miraculous results. A demon prince of Khorne had manifested during a planetary assault. Its presence was reality warping corruption that turned soldiers into berserkers and stone into bleeding flesh. The defending forces should have collapsed. The demon's power was overwhelming. Its corruption spreading through proximity. Its martial prowess unmatched by mortal champions. But the planet's missionaries, thousands of unarmed priests and priestesses, had marched toward the demon singing hymns. No weapons, no armor, just absolute, blinding faith that the Emperor would protect. Manhattan had expected to watch them die, their faith insufficient against material threat. Instead, the demon had recoiled, not from fear. Demons didn't fear mortals, but from pain. The collective faith of thousands focused through religious fervor had created a psychic pressure in real space that wounded the demon's very presence. The hymns weren't just songs. They were weapons. Belief made manifest through the warp, channeling humanity's collective faith in the Emperor into force that opposed chaos corruption. The missionaries died. Certainly, the demons slaughtered hundreds before imperial reinforcements arrived to banish it. But their faith had worked, had produced measurable effects. Had wounded a being that should have been invulnerable to mortal opposition. Manhattan had dismissed imperial faith as superstition, a psychological coping mechanism for populations that needed meaning in meaningless suffering. He had been wrong. In a universe where the warp responded to consciousness, where belief literally reshaped reality, faith was functional. The Imperium's religious fervor wasn't delusion. It was weaponized psychology. Humanity's collective consciousness unified in opposition to chaos. The Emperor wasn't a god in the traditional sense, but the faith of quadrillions had made him something approximating godhood. Their belief sustained his psychic presence, fueled the Astronomicon, created a phenomenon in the warp that opposed the chaos gods through sheer force of human conviction. It was circular logic made reality. They believed he was divine. So he became divine. They worshipped him as salvation. So he became their salvation. They had faith he would protect them, and that faith itself became protective force. The Imperium's theology was self-fulfilling prophecy on a galactic scale. Manhattan perceived this truth with something approaching awe. He had thought the Imperium was broken, its citizens deluded by false promises. But they had created something impossible. A secular being transformed into divine presence through collective belief. A dying man sustained as God through faith's quantum effects on the warp. They had literally believed their emperor into godhood. On Cather, Manhattan approached one of the surviving missionaries. An ancient woman named Palatine Meridia, her body scarred by decades of service. Her faith unshaken despite witnessing the demon's unspeakable horror. "Why do you believe?" Manhattan asked, manifesting before her as she tended to wounded soldiers with gentle hands. Meridia looked up at him without surprise, as though glowing blue strangers were commonplace. "Because faith is all we have, and sometimes all you have is enough. Your faith wounded the demon, made it retreat. This suggests your theology has practical applications beyond psychological comfort. Of course it does, Meridia replied, returning her attention to a soldier whose arm had been corrupted by demonic touch. She prayed over the limb, and Manhattan perceived the warp responding. Chaos taint receding fractionally, the soldier's screaming subsiding. Faith isn't comfort, stranger. It's weapon and shield. The Emperor protects because we believe he protects. Our conviction creates the protection we seek. Circular reasoning. Circular power, Meridia corrected, her voice filled with serene certainty. The universe is cruel, cold, utterly indifferent to our suffering. But we are not indifferent. We impose meaning through belief. We create purpose through conviction. We survive because we decide survival matters. And that decision echoes through the warp itself, reshaping probability. Why in our favor? Manhattan processed this, his mind reeling. Humans created meaning through narrative, through shared stories, through collective agreement about what mattered. In a universe governed by physical law, such meaning was abstract construct. But in a universe where consciousness affected reality through the warp, where belief could manifest as psychic force, meaning became operational principle. The Imperium had weaponized hope, had turned desperation into power source, had created a civilization where suffering itself became fuel for resistance against even greater suffering. You are dying, Manhattan observed, noting Meridia's failing organs, the accumulated damage from decades of exposure to warp phenomena. We are all dying, Meridia replied peacefully, a gentle smile on her worn face. The question is what we do with the time between birth and death. I chose faith, service, giving others hope even when hope seems irrational. It's enough. She died minutes later, her body simply failing, her prayer unfinished. The soldier she'd been treating lived. His corruption halted, his arm saved, his faith strengthened by her sacrifice. Manhattan stood over Meridia's corpse and confronted something he had been avoiding. The possibility that the Imperium's way, however brutal, was the optimal response to their circumstances. That suffering was necessary fuel for survival. That hope, without material justification, was itself a form of power. That faith, even false faith, produced true results when belief was collective and absolute. He had spent years observing, intervening occasionally, trying to understand why humanity survived. Now he understood. They survived because they chose to, against all rational calculation, through sheer force of conviction that choosing otherwise was unacceptable. It was magnificent and horrifying in equal measure. Manhattan teleported to the Astronomican chamber on Terra, the psychic lighthouse that guided ships through the warp, sustained by the Emperor's dying consciousness and the daily sacrifice of psychers whose souls fueled its operation. He observed the process. Psychers brought before the Golden Throne, their consciousness connected to the Emperor's, their life force drained over hours or days to sustain the beacon. They died screaming, their souls consumed, their sacrifice considered holy duty. It was industrial murder dressed as religious sacrament. It was also absolutely necessary. Without the Astronomican, warp navigation became impossible. The Imperium would fragment. Humanity would die scattered across a million isolated worlds. Thousands of psychers sacrificed daily to sustain one dying god who sustained an entire civilization. The mathematics were brutal but functional. The Imperium generated hundreds of thousands of psychers annually through its tithe systems. Most were dangerous, uncontrolled, potential vectors for demonic possession. Using them as fuel solved multiple problems, disposed of dangerous individuals while powering critical infrastructure while reinforcing theological narrative of sacrifice as virtue. It was efficient horror, optimized tragedy, necessary evil scaled to galactic proportions. Manhattan could stop it, could replace the Astronomican's function with his own power, could guide ships through the warp without requiring psycher sacrifice, could save thousands of lives daily, millions annually, billions across centuries. But doing so would make the Imperium dependent on him, would transform him from observer to integral component of their civilization, would strip them of the agency that made their survival meaningful. The price of intervention was eternal responsibility. If he replaced the Astronomican, he would need to maintain it forever. If he left, navigation would fail, and his temporary help would have made their situation worse by creating dependency. You understand now? The Emperor's voice manifested in Manhattan's consciousness, not hostile, but infinitely weary. Why I cannot die. Why I must endure. The moment I stop, everything collapses. The price of becoming essential is eternal imprisonment. Yes, Manhattan acknowledged, the truth a heavy burden. I see the trap. Power makes you responsible. Responsibility makes you prisoner. The more you help, the more they need you, the less capable they become of helping themselves. And yet, sometimes they need help, the Emperor replied, his voice a faint echo. Sometimes intervention is necessary. The art is knowing when intervention enables rather than cripples. I failed at this. I built an Imperium dependent on my presence. And now humanity cannot survive without me. You have been wiser. You intervene sparingly. Leave them their agency. Accept that respecting their choices means accepting their failures. Wisdom feels like cowardice when I watch preventable deaths. That is the burden of power coupled with conscience. The Emperor's voice was faint, strained. The strong who do nothing feel weak. But forcing strength upon those who don't request it is tyranny regardless of beneficial outcome. Manhattan stood in the Astronomican's chamber, surrounded by dying psychers, conversing with a dying god, confronting the paradox that had defined his decade of observation. Power without wisdom was destructive, but wisdom often demanded accepting suffering that power could prevent. There was no resolution to this paradox, only choice repeated endlessly. Intervene or observe, save or respect, impose improvement or accept organic development. Manhattan had come to the 41st millennium seeking to understand why humanity survived. He had found the answer. They survived through conviction that survival mattered, through faith that imposed meaning on meaningless suffering, through collective choice to endure regardless of cost. But he had also learned that survival without joy, without hope, without possibility of improvement, was just slow extinction dressed as persistence. The Imperium endured, but what they endured for had become so diminished that continuation hardly seemed preferable to collapse. What will you do? The Emperor asked, his voice fading. Continue observing, intervene more directly, depart for another universe? Manhattan considered the question, his being torn. He could do any of those things. Could maintain his distant observation, could escalate intervention into active reform, could abandon this universe for the next reality in his endless exploration. Or he could do something he hadn't seriously considered. Stay not as God or Savior, but as witness, as reminder that alternatives existed, as living proof that humanity could evolve beyond current limitations without losing what made humanity valuable. Not forcing change, but modeling possibility. Not imposing improvement, but demonstrating that different configurations were achievable. Not saving them, but showing them they could save themselves. I will remain, Manhattan said finally, the decision settling like a mantle. Not as your savior, not as your God, not as your reformer, but as witness to your struggle, as proof that transcendence is possible, as evidence that suffering, however normalized, is not humanity's inevitable condition. That is more than most offer, the Emperor acknowledged, his voice barely a whisper. Witness then. Remember us. And when we finally fall or finally triumph, let something in the universe remember what we were. Manhattan departed Terra, emerging in the void between stars, his perception expanding across the galaxy. He saw humanity's million worlds, saw their struggles, saw their endless war against entropy and extinction. He saw something else, too, small, defiant moments. A child learning to read despite the Imperium's preference for ignorance. A soldier showing mercy when doctrine demanded brutality. A tech priest questioning rituals and discovering science. A bureaucrat like Volk writing questions in hidden journals. A missionary like Meridia dying to save others. Scattered across the Imperium, millions of individuals choosing small acts of humanity despite systemic pressure toward inhumanity. They were droplets against an ocean, insufficient to reform the civilization, barely noticed by the machinery that ground them down. But they existed, and their existence proved that humanity's essential nature, the capacity for compassion, curiosity, growth, survived beneath imperial conditioning. Perhaps that was enough. Not salvation, not victory, but evidence that the core remained intact, waiting for circumstances that would allow it to flourish again. Manhattan had spent years seeking to understand the Imperium. Now he understood. It was humanity's worst possible configuration, optimized for survival in the worst possible circumstances. It was tragic necessity, horrible efficiency, the price of endurance when extinction was the alternative. And somewhere beneath that necessity, humanity waited, diminished but not destroyed. Suppressed but not eliminated, ready to emerge if conditions ever allowed. Manhattan couldn't change those conditions, but he could bear witness to the waiting. Could remember what humanity had been before desperation. Could imagine what humanity might become after crisis. Could be the bridge between what they were and what they might become if they survived long enough to choose better. That would be his purpose in this dark millennium. Not savior, not judge, just witness, remembering, hoping, waiting. The Emperor protects, the Imperium proclaimed. But perhaps what they needed wasn't protection, but the space to protect themselves. Manhattan hung in the void, glowing softly in the darkness, and continued his observation of humanity's long, brutal struggle toward an uncertain future. The 41st millennium grinds forward, indifferent to the suffering it produces, unconcerned with the billions who die in service to its continuation. The Imperium endures because endurance is all it knows. Survival elevated to sacred principle, sacrifice refined into theological requirement. And through it all, Dr. Manhattan observes, he has learned what he came to understand. Humanity survives not through superior technology or strategic genius, but through stubborn refusal to accept extinction. They survive because they choose to, against mathematical probability, against rational calculation, against the universe's clear preference for their elimination. They survive through faith, not always in gods, but in each other, in purpose, in the belief that their suffering must mean something because meaningless suffering is unbearable. They have created a civilization that transforms horror into duty, desperation into conviction, hopelessness into defiant persistence. It is humanity's worst achievement and its greatest triumph. Simultaneously, Manhattan remains in the 41st millennium. Neither god nor ghost, neither savior nor judge. He intervenes occasionally when intervention serves understanding rather than convenience. He observes constantly, bearing witness to struggles that historians will never record, to sacrifices that theologians will never sanctify, to choices that define what humanity is when everything else is stripped away. He has become what he sought to avoid, connected again, invested in outcomes, caring about a species that can never fully understand him. The loneliness of transcendence has been replaced by something more complicated. The weight of watching beings you care about suffer through choices you could prevent but choose to respect. Perhaps this is what consciousness ultimately means. Not power or knowledge or transcendence, but the burden of caring about others while accepting their agency matters more than your capability. The Imperium doesn't know he watches. Most citizens would reject his presence if they knew, interpreting him through theological frameworks that leave no room for benevolent unknowns. The Inquisition still seeks him occasionally, though he evades detection easily. The Emperor knows he remains and says nothing, perhaps understanding that witnesses serve purposes that participants cannot. On Hadrian's Rest, the evacuated colonists from Crasis IV integrated into the local population, their stories of the glowing stranger becoming myth, then legend, then forgotten footnote in the Imperium's endless documentation. Sergeant Vin died defending the world against orc raiders, her last words a prayer to the Emperor she had served faithfully. The 3 condemned colonists were executed as planned, their bodies burned, their names erased, their sacrifice lost in billions of identical sacrifices. On Veritas Prime, Sebastian Volk continues writing his journals, documenting his questions, knowing they will die with him, but writing anyway because someone must remember that humanity retained capacity for thought. He doesn't know he has a witness who shares his doubts and honors his quiet persistence. On Terra, the Golden Throne continues its eternal function. The Emperor dying by inches, sustained by faith and sacrifice, holding back chaos through sheer force of will and the belief of quadrillions. He endures because he must, because stopping means humanity's extinction, because millennia of agony is preferable to the alternative. And across the Imperium, billions die daily, ground into paste by the machinery of survival. They're suffering the fuel that powers humanity's continuation. They die in trenches and hive factories, on battlefields and in prayer chambers, executed for heresy, or killed by happenstance, or simply worked until their bodies fail. They die, but humanity persists. Manhattan has learned to accept this. Not celebrate it, not endorse it, but accept it. The terrible arithmetic of survival, the brutal calculus that determines who lives and who dies, and why the difference matters less than the continuation. He has learned that respecting agency means accepting tragedy. That honoring choice means watching beings choose suffering, That witnessing requires the discipline to observe without imposing correction. He remains Dr. Manhattan, observer of humanities across realities, seeker of understanding in a universe that offers only questions. But he is no longer alone in his observation. He cares despite the pain caring produces. He hopes despite the futility hope represents. He believes despite knowing belief is often irrational. That somewhere in humanity's future lies the possibility of something better than this eternal grinding against extinction. The Imperium doesn't need a savior. Salvation imposed is tyranny. What it needs is time. Time to evolve, to adapt, to perhaps discover that survival without suffering is achievable. Time to remember that humanity once dreamed of better and might dream again if circumstances allow. Manhattan will give them that time, not through intervention, but through patience. He will bear witness to their struggle. Remember what they were, imagine what they might become. He will be the bridge between present suffering and potential future, the evidence that transcendence doesn't require abandoning humanity's essential nature. The Emperor protects, the faithful proclaim. And in his own way, from a vast distance with infinite patience, so does Dr. Manhattan. Not through miracles, but through remembering. Not through power, but through presence. Not through salvation, but through bearing witness to a species that refuses to surrender despite every reason to accept defeat. The 41st millennium grinds forward. Manhattan observes. Humanity endures. And somewhere in the darkness, possibility waits. The undaunted resolve accelerated toward the planet, its weapon batteries charging, its crew singing hymns as they prepared for battle, and on Crasis IV's surface, colonists huddled in darkness, praying for salvation that would never come.